So the question was the like cultural roots of Jewish observances. Are those included in the book? They may be included sort of episodically, but I do try to include them in ceremonial work that we do. So at Kol Hadash, we have a home Hanukkah booklet that people can print out at home and use for their own candle lighting. And there are multiple ways to do that. One version has a different value for each night. Another version talks about different aspects of the Hanukkah holiday for each night. And in that one, I do include the real story behind the dreidel and the idea that this idea of a light festival when it's dark out is not uniquely Jewish, that other cultures have that too. And where the latke comes from and the difference between a Chanukiah versus a menorah and who uses which term. So I try to embed it in the ceremonial material. The other place to find it is I have an online class that I taught through my congregation when we were in COVID times. And then since we were doing it on Zoom anyways, you just hit record and voila, you've got a video. And it's now on the Institute's YouTube channel. And there's one that's an introduction to Jewish history, one is an introduction to Jewish culture, and one is on the philosophy of secular humanistic Judaism. And so if you want to hear some of these like secret history of these symbols, go to the one on Purim, and you can learn the real story of the Hamantash, which actually had nothing to do with Haman originally. His hat does not have three corners. He's not a colonialist, right? The three hats. And some people also call them Haman's ears. In Israel, they're called Oznei Haman because he was a Vulcan, I guess, and pointed ears. No, actually, the Hamantash began, and you have to use it. You have to use German. And I have to say something before I say anything else about Hamantash. It's one Hamantash and many Hamantashen. You cannot have one Hamantashen grammatically. Now, I know people use it wrong all the time, and I should get over it, but I can't. So I encourage you to say one Hamantash, many Hamantashen. So what is the origin of the Hamantash? Well, originally, again, you have to know German to get it. It was a Tasch, which is a pocket. Tasch is a pocket. And Mon in German is poppy seed. So it was a poppy seed pocket, a montage. And then some Jewish wit came up with a pun and said, oh, it's a Hamontash. It's a Haman's pocket with the poppy seeds in it. And then, of course, they come up with other ingredients like apricot and chocolate and whatever you find. There's even a savory Hamantashen out there now with the meats and stuff. Well, for some, it's anathema, but for others, it's not. I'll point out that your bagel tray out there is not traditional because you have Asiago cheese and blueberry. And, you know, for some people, that's not a bagel. That's not a real bagel. But my approach is if that bagel activates your Jewishness and you like blueberries, in Yiddish you say, Gesundheit, go in good health and do it for yourself. Yeah, Carol. Right. Also means the, but in this case, it was trying to make the pun on Haman and combined with the pun. So Carol's asking, how do you learn all this stuff? Calling me the epitome of a rabbi is amusing because I know what I think. So I actually grew up in a humanistic Jewish congregation in suburban Detroit. Sherwin Wein was my congregational rabbi. Actually, he had been both my mother-in-law and my mother's rabbi at different times when he was still a Reform rabbi, even before he started humanistic Judaism with that first group of families. So where did I get my Jewish learning? Well, some of it was from my congregational experience. They had a Sunday school from kindergarten all the way through high school. So we learned Jewish history, humanistic philosophy, and that stuck because I like history. And then when I went to college, Sherwin had suggested I think about becoming a rabbi. So I majored in Jewish studies at Yale. So I did a lot of Jewish history and culture. And the irony was I had learned a lot about Jewish history from my Sunday school education. I hadn't learned as much about traditional Jewish practice from my Sunday school, even though I went all the way through high school, because that wasn't our focus. It was focused differently. So when I went to a friend's house for Passover, I got to experience the traditional Haggadah. And that was a very different experience from what I had grown up only doing humanistic Haggadah. In the Birmingham Temple in that era, in the 80s and early 90s, the Torah lived in the library and they never used it. It had cobwebs on it. Honestly, there were cobwebs on it because it had never been taken out. It was there symbolically. Now, it was taken out early on in the movement. They did Torah commentary bar bat mitzvahs. But later on, they shifted to the topic or the role model, the hero bar mitzvah, and you didn't use the Torah scroll. So when I started working there as an assistant rabbi, I thought, let's let's make this not mystery. So we take it out, we open it up, the kids get to see what it looks like, they can even feel the edge of what it feels like. That it shouldn't be something foreign to them. This should also be part of their inheritance, but that was, another generation's approach. So I got a lot of my traditional Jewish learning from my undergraduate degree in Jewish studies, my master's, and ultimately PhD in Jewish studies at University of Michigan. And then also some of it from our rabbinic education at the International Institute. Again, it's always a balancing act. How much time do you spend on what you don't do versus how much time do you spend on what is relevant and meaningful? What kind of skills do you develop? We don't drill our rabbinic students in reciting the traditional prayers over and over again because that's not the skill they need. They need to know how to make a service, how to create something new, more than just repeat what was old. So that's part of our challenging approach as a movement, is to get leaders and rabbis out there who are well-versed in traditional Jewish knowledge and history, but also well-versed in modern approaches and have the wisdom to know the difference and the creativity to make something meaningful out of all of that for their communities. You've experienced that with Rabbi Cohen, of course, some of which is the benefit of our education, a lot of which is the benefit of her talent and knowledge herself. It's like a parent. You'd like to take some credit, but they really get a lot of the credit themselves. Yes, Alan.
Talk about Woody Allen and Jewish humor.
Okay, the question is Woody Allen and Jewish humor, although in some circles he's persona non grata, given the choices he's made in his life. The whole definition of Jewish humor is tricky because some of it is comparable to other kind of humors you'll find around the world. Some of it has a particularly self-deprecating approach, which is almost a kind of, if not internalized anti-Semitism, at least internalized doubt and angst. It's not an accident that Freud developed his theories with primarily upper-class Jewish women in Vienna. Neurosis and worrying about things and overfocus and overthinking. And, some of those are particular psychological profiles of a particular cultural group. But of course, there are Jews that grew up in the Middle East. My father's family were all from Syria. It's actually how we got the spelling of my name with a CH. It's pronounced Shalom, but that's the French spelling because my father's family were in Aleppo, Syria, when Syria was under the control of the French, and then moved to Paris, and then from Paris to New York. And so they have the French spelling like Chateau or Champagne. But there are collections of Mizrahi, of Eastern Jewish humor. There's whole collections of Soviet Jewish humor that are very different than what you think of as stereotypical Jewish humor. This is a subset of a larger debate of whether there is such a thing as one Jewish culture, because it's so diverse in so many places, with so many climates and so many languages, and so many foods, that maybe it makes more sense to talk about Ashkenazi Jewish culture, or even Eastern Ashkenazi Jewish culture versus Western Ashkenazi Jewish culture, or Northeastern Ashkenazi Litvak culture versus Southeastern Ashkenazi Galicianer culture. You can get into subsets, right? However, what I find is it makes sense to have like an umbrella Jewish culture and then subcultures. So you have Ethiopian Jewish culture, which is very different from Yemenite Jewish culture, which is very different from Eastern European Polish Jewish culture, but they all have a Passover. They all have a Hanukkah of some kind, although not a few places don't, because their Judaism ends with the Tanakh, ends with the Hebrew Bible, and there is no Hanukkah in the Hebrew Bible. So there's all these subcultures that have the umbrella identity of Jewish, and even more importantly, getting back to this idea of how you self-identify, how you define yourself, what defines a Jewish book for you, all of those groups call themselves Jewish. So that counts in identifying them as Jewish. What's American culture? What's American food? Is it Tex-Mex? Is it Low Country, South Carolina food that was often invented by and brought over from Africa by slaves? Was it, or enslaved people? Was it American-style Chinese food that made its way to New York or to California? Is it American-style sushi where wasabi is actually horseradish, but nobody will tell you that? So there's all these foods that count as American food because and the hamburger and the apple pie and all that stuff, they're all under the umbrella of America, even if they're subcultures. So I would say there's an umbrella of Jewish culture, Jewish humor that will have its subgroups that may be very different from each other, but they're relating to Jewish identity. They claim that identification, and that's enough for me. Yes. Absolutely. The question for those online is it just a function of the book itself or the author themselves, or is it an interaction between the book story or theater play or movie, and the audience or the individual that's experiencing that. It may be that it resonates with a Jewish audience in a different way than it resonates with others. I'll draw another example from the food world. There's one day a year that Chinese food is Jewish food. Right? One day a year. And you better get your reservations in early. Otherwise, you are not getting a seat. My wife actually went to Carleton College and was living in the Twin Cities for a while. And she had a couple of friends who wanted to go out to their favorite Chinese restaurant on December 25th. And she said, you better call them and get a reservation. And her friends who weren't Jewish said, what are you talking about? That's no problem. They got the last table. It was a card table set up in the corner with 3 chairs crammed into it. But that's because it's a Jewish holiday on that day. It's a Jewish observance, Jewish cuisine. Right, or Jewish American for sure. That's right. Fair enough. So the reality is that the audience has a big impact on the reception of the material, of the literature. And that's why I said whatever strikes you or appeals to you or connects to you as being Jewish, I'm willing to accept that. Now, there will be people who will say reading the New Testament is a Jewish experience for them, if they're, Jews for Jesus or other groups like that. And I can't tell them you're wrong in how you feel. I might disagree with how they've organized their community or what they do in dealing with other Jews in their proselytizing approach. But in the end, they've defined it as a Jewish experience for them. And I think that for some people, they can read non-Jewish authors and it resonates for them in a Jewish way. One of the essays in the book by Denise Handlarski, who's a rabbi in Toronto in our movement, is about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa. She did a lot of her research on that for her dissertation. And she found ways to connect it to the Jewish experience, even though the people participating in that experience were not Jewish. But think about what might have happened with a Truth and Reconciliation experience in the Israeli-Palestine conflict or with a post-World War II experience. It's an interesting thought process to see how that experience of another people resonates with Jewish history in your own way as the reader. And I think that's what makes Jewish culture interesting and challenging, is this dialogue between the content and the reader. Yes, please. So for the benefit of those online, this was a question about comparing the Jewish experience to the Kurdish experience in a recent article, but also more broadly, what do you compare Judaism to? Is it a religion? So you compare it to other religions? Is it an ethnic group or a national group that should get compared to those? How unique is the Jewish experience or the challenges that Jews are facing? What I like to say is the Jews are like everybody else, only more so. So what that means is we have our particular experience, and there are many things we have in common with other groups. There is no one people that is the only diasporic people that's been spread out. There are Armenians all over the world who identify with that identity. The Roma people have been dispersed for centuries. The Kurds are another one that didn't fit in the European drawn lines of a national identity at the time they did so in the 20th century. So there are plenty of other diasporic people, and even larger national groups. There's a Chinese diaspora in Indonesia that's very substantial. In fact, the word diaspora is another Greek word that we borrowed because it began with the Greek city-states that were scattered all over the Mediterranean, these trading posts where Greeks lived. And the word diaspora comes from Greek. Dia is like diagram, spreading out, and spore are seeds, like spores. So it's a spreading of seeds that take root in different soil, that grow a little bit differently with different sun and different water and different climate, but have a common origin in that original plant. So the Jewish diaspora that began in 500 BCE with those who didn't come back from the Babylonian exile goes back a long way. And so that is unique to the Jewish story, but there are other peoples that had a similar experience. I guess the best way to explain this is every analogy, every cultural comparison is like a leaky bucket where it carries water for a certain amount of distance, but eventually it's going to run out because it's not exactly the same. Even that metaphor runs out of steam at some point. So that's when you are comparing the Jews to the Kurds or the Jews to other peoples. The Roma people, for example, don't focus very much on memory in their particular culture. So it's harder to reconstruct their history because they haven't ingrained those events into their collective memory the way that Jews have, who do focus on memory. So this is where each culture is similar, but also going to be a little different. And the most important thing to remember is that something can be definitive or characteristic of being Jewish without being uniquely Jewish. So I have an article in the book asking the question, are there Jewish values? We like to think there are Jewish values, right? Like education. Well, there are other peoples that also value education and emphasize education. You look at people going to their Japanese schools or Chinese school. I mean, in Minnesota, you've got all these language schools. I mean, we're in a German immersion language school. And my guess is at least some of the students here have ethnically German families that want the kids to know their heritage. This is one way to do that. So there are other peoples that also value that, but that doesn't mean that education is not a Jewish value. It is a Jewish value. Thank goodness today it's a universal Jewish value and not just a male-only Jewish value, because historically, education was for men and not necessarily for women. There was even a version of the Hebrew Bible translated into Yiddish called the Tzenu Urena, which is grammatically a feminine plural form. And in the frontispiece to the book, it said that this book is for women and for men who are like women. What that meant was not what we might think today. What it meant was men who can't read Hebrew. Because real men would learn Hebrew and be able to read the original, but if they couldn't, they could read the approximate version, which is this Yiddish translation with other legends mixed into it, and that's the Tzena Urena, the for women and for men who are like women, but weren't the real elevated, educated men. Nowadays, of course, we treat the vast majority of the Jewish world treats Jewish education as something that applies to both men and to women. Even in the Orthodox Jewish world, in the 1920s, they started a whole series of schools called the Beis Yaakov schools to educate young Jewish Orthodox girls, in part because they were all going to the Bund schools that offered education for women and were leading them astray on the religious front. So then the Orthodox world, by competition, by Jewish competition, had to create some kind of schooling for girls. It didn't come out of the Talmud by itself. It came out by cultural context and by Jewish competition. So long answer to the question that there are parallels to other cultures and other religious traditions and so on, but we have to do our best to see what's common and maintain what's distinct while not claiming that distinct is better. We didn't invent ethics. We don't have a monopoly on ethics, but we do have particular values that are definitive of a Jewish community. Sure. So that phrase rooted cosmopolitan is absolutely a play on the old accusation that was made against Jews, sometimes in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, that Jews were rootless cosmopolitans. They were only citizens of the world. Again, cosmopolitan comes from cosmos, universal, and polis is the city, like political. So the cosmopolitan was a citizen of the world, and if you were a rootless cosmopolitan, you were disloyal. You had no sense of inherent and sort of rooted connection to the soil and the people among whom you lived. You were dangerous. You were risky. You were what today is called a globalist, right? That doesn't have any rooted identity. So by calling oneself a rooted cosmopolitan, it's absolutely in dialogue with that accusation, saying that I am rooted in my particular culture or where I'm living and so on. And it is pushing back on that old model. Now, the question is that a good model for us? Or are we, as Barry put it, uprooted cosmopolitans? Because we're not even necessarily that deeply rooted in our Jewishness either. You know, we're reconnecting with it. We've broken away enough to find a way to find our way back, just like that Torah scroll that goes in a library and you don't use it. You have it as an heirloom, but don't take it out. I think to some extent our movement has done that, where in our first generation, the 60s and 70s, you know, you have that breakaway model, or in the early 1910s and 20s, Jewish anarchist groups would have a Yom Kippur ball where they would have a buffet and they would have music and dancing. And so their Yom Kippur was, let's break all those rules to show how free we are. The challenge is that their kids don't know the joke. For the kids, Yom Kippur is the ball. It's not, and it's also this sort of uplifting, joyous celebration. Growing up at Birmingham Temple, Sherwin Wine would have us sing Hava Nagila on Yom Kippur because it's part of the Jewish New Year festival. And so you have a joyous New Year festival on the first day, you have a joyous New Year's festival day on the second, on the end of the holiday for Yom Kippur, and we can be uplifted. And as I started creating my own services and thinking about how I would approach the holiday, I decided to treat it sort of like the elastic, where you go far away and then maybe you come back a little bit. So I'm open to having a Yom Kippur that is contemplative, that is asking questions of what did I do wrong and what can I do better? How can I repair relationships with other people? What can our community do better in a collective sense? It doesn't have to be just because I'm free, I'm going to sing Hava Nagila on Yom Kippur. So that's part of that getting your roots back, that rerouting yourself. It's very different if someone chooses to go back to a practice than if they received it in a straight transmission line. So my father grew up in an Orthodox Jewish family, but they were sort of Sephardic style Orthodox. They were a little more flexible than you might find some of the Ashkenazi fanaticism. But we never bothered with keeping Passover kosher at our home. In fact, we spent Passover with his family in New York once, and I asked, "Why can't I have a sandwich?" I didn't understand why everything was matzah all the time. But when my wife and I created our own household, she felt it was important for us to do something. So maybe we don't eat bread during that week as our version of it. But we're not going to be fanatic about the cereals or any of that stuff. Later on, she became celiac, so she couldn't have gluten anyway. So we were already using the rice-based products. But the point of it was we were able to make that choice. And choosing which practices you want to follow, choosing where you put your roots down is different from inheriting it without a break and feeling like you have to do it because we've always done it this way. Of all Jews in the world, humanistic Jews should never say, this is the way we've always done it. Because we've changed so much else. And if it worked 50 years ago or 30 years ago when the community was founded, fine, but it has to still work today. You know, there's even, you may or may not know this, another melody for Efo Ori out there. Written in the 1990s by a group in New York, our city congregation, who had some folk artists, singers involved there. Because when they asked the kids, what's the song about? They said, it's a sad song because it's a minor melody. And they said, well, let's see if we can do it differently. And so they created a new version, a new melody for the song. Now, when that melody made its way to Michigan, I was appalled. How dare you change that melody? Wasn't what I was used to. But then I thought about it. I said, you know, maybe they have a point. And in my community, we've only done the new melody. They wouldn't know that old melody because we've only done the new melody. And that's okay that you have different melodies in different communities. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. But again, we can't say this is the way we've always done it. We have to be open to new creativity. Right. Yes. So this comment was that the book isn't a book until it's been read, and different people organize their shelves differently. I've seen one person who organized their bookshelf by color. I found it very disturbing. But that's one way you can do it. And it looks beautiful, you know, like it's like a work of art. But because your brain is organizing by color and you remember, oh, it's one of the red books. So you connect to that. But I'm not going to argue about that because I'm not defending it. I'm just saying it has. But you know, what you count as a Jewish book may differ upon your ideology. So in a more Orthodox community, they might only have prayer books and religious ideology books, where in a conservative that's still observant but a little more open to the modern world bookshelf, they might have novels of Philip Roth or Jewish cookbooks or other things on the same shelf. They would have prayer books and Hebrew Bibles and so on. And your Jewish bookshelf is going to be different from my Jewish bookshelf. I mean, I appreciate Eva's compliment at the beginning of my Jewish bookshelves, but the reality is that there was only half of them. The other half were at the office. But we also have the choice factor. What's meaningful on your shelf versus what's meaningful on someone else's. And that's why I don't feel like I need to lay down the law of what is or is not a Jewish book because it's going to resonate for you differently. I mean, some of them will be broadly accepted as Jewish books. You know, the novels of Philip Roth that have Jewish characters who grapple with their Jewishness and use Yiddish in there. And some of them are going to check a lot of boxes that most people would deem them to be Jewish books. And others may be, you know, more flexible. So Kafka short stories, again, you might say, reflect some Jewish angst or alienation from society or parental dynamics, but that could also be the human existential condition, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Jewish, depending on how you read it. Yes, please.
I always consider Midrash to be very short stories. Are there any novels that you would consider to be in the Midrash vein?
So the question is, are Midrash sort of retellings of Bible stories or commentaries on biblical stories? Are they generally sort of short episodes, or there were even some people speculate part of sermons that rabbis would give, where the punchline is the verse that they're connecting their story to? My dissertation was actually on a phenomenon I called modern Midrash, which is modern retellings of biblical stories. A lot of it's done in poetry, so that's in a sort of shorter format, but sometimes it's done in a novel format. You might have heard of a book called The Red Tent by Anita Diamant. which is a retelling of the patriarchs and matriarchs story from her own perspective. The sort of pinnacle or the center of the story is the narrative of Dinah, which I think is Genesis 38, 39, somewhere in there, where she goes out to meet the daughters of the land, and a Canaanite prince sees her and wants her and takes her. And there's some debate over whether that was, takes her to wife, and it's sort of a mutual swept off her feet, Daniel Steele kind of romance, which is how Damon tells it, or if it was a rape and a violation of property rights and so on, which is how rabbinic commentary takes it. And then she sort of disappears from the story after her two brothers wind up killing all the people that were part of this community that took her. So what the Red Tent does is it, first of all, starts telling the story from the women's point of view, not from the men's point of view. It's a little bit like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard, which is Hamlet from the other perspective. And there's other versions like that. There's a book called Ahab's Wife, which is about Ahab from Moby Dick, but from, or Pilot's Wife is another one that came out. Wide Sargasso Sea is from the perspective of the mad wife in Jane Eyre, who's locked in the attic, but you get her take on the story and how she met the main male character. So this kind of retelling from women's perspectives is a common genre of retold stories, but by doing it about a Bible story and by doing it with Jewish categories in your mind. And Diamant herself has written books on celebrating the new Jewish wedding and how to become Jewish and other clearly Jewish topics. One gets the sense that this is grappling with their Jewish identity. She even puts at the very beginning of the book, thanks to Rabbi Harold Kushner, her rabbi, who taught her about Midrash. So she's already dropping the hint that this is a kind of Midrash. Now, she got a lot of flack for that because part of her book was saying that old version the men told is just wrong. Well, you can't say that baldly if you want to sell your books in conservative Jewish circles. Actually, one of the keys for the book being successful was the publisher sent free copies to a list they got of women clergy, both in the ministry and in the rabbinate. And then they recommended it to their book groups, and the book groups took off. So if you know anybody who runs a book group who might be interested in contemporary humanistic Judaism, that would be a big help. The other thing you can do, by the way, which we've actually done in the Chicago area to some success, is recommend it to your local library. So local libraries are buying new books all the time. This has been reviewed by the Jerusalem Post. It's from a university press, so it has some credibility behind it, and the Jewish Publication Society. If you're in a community that has a decent Jewish population or a collection in the library of Jewish books, this belongs there. And then this may, redound to the benefit of Oramet because somebody's searching, they saw that news report and they want to look for something on humanistic Judaism. And guess what's in the library or in the new acquisitions in the newsletter that goes out? It's a book about humanistic Judaism. And the best part is most websites for libraries have a form you fill out. It takes 5 minutes. It costs you nothing but a little bit of time, and it helps to spread the word for the movement. So why not? So Richard's comments for those online were basically don't mock food, because it's very important, and that culture is a fundamental building block for understanding the world and for organizing diversity. So it's a very important part of Jewish identity, but also other people's identity and how they relate to each other. So the question was that if the reader response defines what a Jewish book is, can you define what a good Jewish book is, and specifically, what would you recommend I read? Next. So I'll share a couple of my favorites. There's a beautiful book that's not that new, but still is a profound book about understanding Jewish memory and Jewish history. It's called Zachor, Z-A-K-H-O-R, I think, or C-H-O-R, maybe Z-A-C-H-O-R, by Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi. It's only about 110 pages long, based on a few lectures he gave at a university. But it's a profound meditation on the difference between Jewish memory and Jewish history, where many people are more interested in what we thought happened than what really happened. We assigned it actually in one of our classes on Jewish philosophy, and all the students report this is really a fascinating and interesting take on how we understand who we are and how we came to be. A second book that I really loved is called The History of Love by Nicole Krauss. She is a beautiful writer. She's also got a book of short stories and some other things that she's written, another novel called Forest Dark that came out later, but The History of Love was one of her first novels, and it is absolutely heartbreakingly beautiful. It's actually also a great audiobook if you like audiobooks because they've done it. It's done in multiple like perspectives and voices. So they have different voice actors reading the different characters. So it's almost like a radio play that you're listening to, but it's really just wonderful. I also loved Jonathan Safran Foer's Everything is Illuminated, which was his first novel. I really like that. I love the magical realism part of it. And just, I mean, I pulled quotes of it and used it in services because I find them so moving. I'm trying to think of other
That's a
recent
good
books.
movie too.
Yeah, they made a decent movie out of it. It makes a nice reading and movie watching because the movie doesn't do the jump back and forth in time and the different voices in the same way that the novel does, which you can't do in a movie necessarily. So it sort of thins down the story to sort of the main narrative, which itself is very moving, and the visuals are really wonderful. But it makes a great sort of contrast discussion like that. I'm trying to think of others that I've read. I mean, I spent so much time reading and rereading this manuscript, it sort of has blocked out everything else that's in my brain. I have a book actually I brought with me on this trip called Raising Secular Jews, which is a study of the magazines and journals that secular Jewish communities and movements published for their students from 1910 to about 1960. And you know what their ideology was and how they approached issues like tradition and Bible and so on for a explicitly secular Jewish audience, but also trying to create this literary experience by anthologizing and choosing and simplifying the language for student readers of what they felt to be the best Jewish books of the era were. So I'm interested to see how it comes out. Yes, so the first two I mentioned is, the first one is Zachor, Z-A-C-H-O-R, and the author's last name is Yerushalmi, Y-E-R-U-S-H-A-L-M-I. And the second one is The History of Love by Nicole Krauss, K-R-A-U-S-S. I will mention one other thing, because there is an early Yiddish writer whose name was Mendel Mocher Sforim, which means Mendel of the bookseller. So Mocher Sforim, selling books, is an old Jewish tradition. We do have discussion guides for many of the books that the Institute publishes. We do have one for this new one as well, but many of the other books we also have discussion guides for, and they might make interesting, book club reading or other explorations for a community to have a chance to dive into our ideas a little bit more, but not just from a didactic teacher presenting it, but for an interactive and your own reader response experience of reading the ideas. So this is a tricky question of how my children have taken the identity, in part because they are a work in progress, as are we all. Okay? One is 19, one is 17. The second reason why I hesitate to answer this question is this is my job, but not their job. So I don't necessarily want to say what they think or what they talk to me about because they're talking to dad. They're not talking to their rabbi. So I'm sort of going to pass on answering that question in any great detail. I mean, they've had different ways they've connected to their Jewishness. My daughter went to a Jewish summer camp. That's part of the Hapanim Dror sort of left-wing Zionist approach, although she's evolved a bit from there. And my son is in a junior klezmer orchestra, so he connects with that, and he likes languages, so he's picked up how to read Yiddish. And so, they each have their own way of exploring it. And I've always told them, this is your choice. You're making your identity and your values. And look, the reality is kids are going to make their own choices anyways, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
So either we set up a framework where they're able to do that and we affirm them in their ability to make those choices, or we squeeze our fist tighter, trying to hold them and force them to think what we want them to think, and it's never going to work. So in the end, we have to find the way to affirm their choices, and hopefully they come to the evolution to agree with us. But we can't guarantee it. I sometimes think of our relationship to Jewish tradition as 3 stages. When you're 5 years old, you think your parents know everything. When you're 15 years old, you're convinced your parents know absolutely nothing. When you're 25, maybe 35, you realize that your parents got some things right and maybe made some other mistakes. They were people, they did their best. And you get to choose in your own life what you draw from them and what you do differently. And the same thing with Jewish culture. There are some parts that are wonderful, but it's not all wonderful. There are some parts that are terrible, but it's not all terrible either. There are all parts that were made by people. They were evolving out of Jewish culture and Jewish experience and the human mind and creativity. And so we get to draw from that what we find most resonant and add to that store, that library, our own books and our own ideas that will be part of a future Jewish canon that we might not have a role in choosing, but we have a role in creating. Is there a last question?
It might be too long, so I
Okay.
don't know. But my question for you as a visiting rabbi is, when I first joined Oramet, it was with my husband at the time, who we're not married anymore, but he was a natural skeptic, atheist, and he would bring up, oh, just wait 100 years and Sherwin Wine is going to be your Jesus. And he was like very concerned about that. So I'm curious, like, your response to that sort of sentiment.
So the question was, are we a cult? Where we have our prophet, non-prophet maybe, who showed up with the message. And our job is to memorize and repeat the message as the prophet delivered. I hope in the way I've talked about Sherwin, I don't come across that way. And I think it's important, you know, that mature relationship with your past also applies to the evolution of humanistic Judaism. I mean, Sherwin was a brilliant, brilliant person, encyclopedic knowledge on just about every topic you can imagine, and he had his limitations too. We can see that in some of his writings. You can see that in having interacted with him. I'll give you an example that just came up this last week or last month. I was working on getting a Wikipedia entry for me accepted by the Wikipedia gods that get to decide what goes in and doesn't. I was successful. You can look me up. I now exist on Wikipedia. But in doing so, one of our members decided to ask ChatGPT to write a version of that Wikipedia post that's like a starting point, and then we can edit it and so on. And there were some parts that got correct, and there were some parts that were flat out wrong. And there were some parts that sounded like an undergraduate trying to fill an essay with fancy sounding words that really don't say very much. But one of the parts that got flat wrong was it said that Sherwin Wine was great at collaborating with his students because Shalom helped to edit his history book of provocative people. And so that shows how well he collaborated. And he had wonderful abilities, but sharing space was not one of them. I edited that book after he died, and it came out 5 years, in fact, after he died. I'll give you an example of that experience. Once we were supposed to co-teach a session on Jewish life cycle, and I figured it wouldn't be 30 minutes and 30 minutes. I thought maybe 40 minutes and 20 minutes. It was 55 minutes and 5 minutes. Now, he had a lot to say that was very interesting. You know, the students got a lot out of it. But sharing space, maybe not the best. All of us have teachers that are wonderful and flawed in their own way. Our movement does as well. We don't have prophets. We don't have saints that are perfect and that teach us exactly what we have to do. I don't want a community or a movement that agrees with me 100% of the time. It gets me nervous because now I'm the cult. So I always have encouraged our people to follow through on the lesson of our philosophy, which is make up your own mind. Now, it's paradoxical. I'm telling you, make up your own mind. There's a contradiction there. It's like that scene in The Life of Brian. He says, you're all individuals. We're all individuals. Right. Well, you are all individuals, and you get to make up your own mind. You'll agree with me some of the time. You'll disagree other times. Maybe you agree with me 90% of the time. Great. Then we have something to talk about. So I would like a movement of diverse ideas and opinions that has common ground, that has something we share. And if it gets down to 40% of you or 30% that you agree with me, then maybe it's not a good fit. But I don't think that we are a cult or a movement that's following an ideological authoritarian style leader. We are a trend of people who have similar values. My congregation for a while was debating what a good promotional slogan would be for us. My favorite was cheap and easy. I thought that would be great, you know, having a t-shirt like that. It didn't make it that far in the bracket competition we had. I also liked Matzah Without Dogma. That was a good one. One of the ones that we settled on was, I think, In Good We Trust. But one of the ones that really summed it up for me, even though it was too long for a bumper sticker, was like-minded people who don't think alike. We have a similar approach to life, ask similar questions, have similar values, but we don't have to agree on everything to feel part of one community. That's that diversity and unity, or as Rabbi Sivan Moss from Israel sometimes puts it, unity without uniformity. You don't have to all be the same to feel like we're on the same team.